Okay, we're back, folks. The Nerdy Pastor here, and just a reminder that if these videos are helpful for you, you can like and subscribe right below there, and it just helps me know who is benefiting from this, and helps build a nice community of folks that are interested in kind of things that we promote and try to teach here. And it's just intentional Orthodox Christianity, obviously from a Reformed viewpoint. Though I am Presbyterian, Baptists, and all other kinds, Anglicans, and others are welcome. This is not trying just to get one point across. It's kind of a broadly reformational viewpoint typically that I come from, though I do make distinctions where they are necessary to help for clarity purposes. We've been doing for a while 3 or 4 different kind of series at the same time, and so we continue that tradition with kind of plopping around in different parts of the series I'm doing. And this one's going to go on for a while because I like books, I like to read, and I'm finishing this one up. There's only, I think, 20 pages left in this book for me to go, and I thought I'd just go ahead and finish this as I reach the point of the finish line and the exhaustion here. But I bought this book a few years back with the intention of hoping to read it someday. It was so challenging. I opened it up a couple times. It's been this way with a couple systematic books I've read in the past, where you've opened up, you've read the preface, you've read the introduction, you've read the first chapter, like, this is challenging. This is a really hard book. And so I knew to read this book, I was going to need what I've said before is kind of another sojourner with me to read this one, because this one's a hard one. It's hard to get up for this kind of challenge. And so the book is Katherine Sonderegger's The Doctrine of God. And I mean, first of all, Katherine Sonderegger, kind of an Anglican, but more from a conservative, I wouldn't say evangelical, but evangelical-ish, kind of lower church Anglicanism that really pursues classic Orthodox doctrine in this book and in her other book as well that came after. It's a 3-volume trilogy of doctrine. But saw this book 5 years ago when it came out, bought the book immediately, knew I was going to want to read it, hoped to read it someday, but needed a sojourner to go along with me, cojourner, that's probably a better word for it, to do this, and found my sister, who I've read a lot of books with in reading groups before, and she was up for the task. And we started this a few months back and are now 1 week away from finishing this book of about 530 pages long. Sonderegger is really, in my view, a female ninja. A female Yoda. I mean, Katherine Sonderegger, first of all, if I'm correct, I might be wrong on this, but I believe she's the first woman to ever write and publish a Christian systematic theology, which is just floors me that she's the first. That's taking this long for the first, but she is the first to write a full-fledged systematic theology, Christian theology, and published it in 2016. The second volume came out in 2021. The third will come out in a couple more years. But this is just on the doctrine of God. And this book is so rich, so challenging. I am not going to even begin to try to give you some comprehensive summary. But I thought I'd take 10 minutes and I'd give you the highlights from me, just a few points that are just riveting points about this book, and then give just a few drawbacks from the book. There's much less drawback than there are selling points for this book. But first is this, just as a pro, I would call this book, and I think I'd even call this series, but definitely more the first volume, The Empire Strikes Back. So, it's Sonderegger versus the world. I mean, that's really what this book is like. You're reading this book, if you've read anything from contemporary theology, Moltmann, Bultmann, Pannenberg, Barth, Bonhoeffer, von Balthasar, Rahner. If you've read anything from contemporary theology, in many respects, she says, I really appreciate everything you guys have done, but we're going back. No. It's kind of like a gentle no, but it's like, no. It's kind of the Empire Strikes Back kind of. I'm not saying that all that modernity stuff I just said is all unorthodox. No, it's not. There's many parts of it that are unorthodox, yes. But she's saying, no, we're going all the way back. So it's kind of the Empire Strikes Back against modern theology, and really harkens back to kind of a neo-Augustinianism. So know this first. She is not kind of lockstep with modern theology. From the 20th century on, she's dialoguing with all of them in the book, but she's really resisting them in so many ways. I mean, there's not 1 or 2 pages you can read that she's not kind of resisting or disagreeing with them at some point. So if you like classic Christian theology, classic Christian Doctrine, the doctrine of God according to the creeds. You are going to love this book. There's so much here that's so good. So The Empire Strikes Back, and she's basically a female version of Yoda that comes in and just takes no prisoners. I mean, with the modernists, and she's most indebted to Karl Barth for sure in this book of the group of modernists, but disagrees with him left and right at the same time. So just love to see that from not necessarily the most conservative theologian. So watch that. But very conservative in many respects, and very in a disagreeing tone, but fair and friendly, disagreeing a lot with Karl Barth throughout. Though Barth's probably her hero, I would say. Another point that's just strong is this book it can be read, if you've read enough theology, I would suggest other theology books to read first systematically for this one. But if you've read a couple and you kind of want to read something just incredibly rich that would lead you to pray, this is the book for you. There's not a lot of theology books that will just immediately lead you to pray, but great theologians will. She is of the upper crust, guys, girls. She's of the upper crust, where it's just such a rich volume of theology. It will lead you to live for the Lord. It will lead you to pray, to be dependent upon Him. She just breaks into song, it feels like sometimes. She breaks into prayer. She breaks into awesome, just wonder of God in the middle of the book. It's not like she has these sections that just kind of, now it's time to pray. It's kind of like just in the midst. It feels a lot like Paul in many ways, where there's just this recollection of the great redemptive work of God and the reality of who He is as the one, the singular, the simple God of the Bible, and then she'll just break into song, break into prayer, break into adoration of God. And I think that is a strength of this book. It really leads you to love the Lord. And again, I think that's what Christian theology is supposed to do, but not every book does that. Another great positive of this book is that it is fairly well divided. Sometimes theology books, they get so detailed about what they divide. It's like every 2 pages there is a division subheading, and it's hard to kind of follow that, to be honest. It's so much information. It feels like they should have subsumed it more into larger categories for reading. She does an excellent job. The book, while it is dense and challenging to read, you know what she's saying eventually. She gets around to it, and she doesn't overemphasize the details and subheadings so you get lost. She's always kind of circling back and helping you find out where she's at. And then I think fourthly, what I would say simply is this. The book really majors that God is simple. That God simply is not just He has love or He has righteousness, but He is love and He is righteousness. He is all His attributes, and His attributes are Him. So He doesn't have attributes. They're not attributed to Him, okay? He is His attributes. And I think it really helps. The more you read her, the more you understand the clarity of that reality, that this is the classic doctrine of simplicity. This is what Anselm and Aquinas and Augustine and the creeds are. This is what the classic Orthodox Christian faith is teaching. So again, if you want a classic Orthodox Christian book on the doctrine of God that really harkens back from the creeds on, and really is The Empire Strikes Back on the modern theology of, modern theology basically is typically thought by the historians to start at the Romans commentary of Karl Barth, 1918 and on. So if you really want to push back on that, this is the book for you. Okay, this is an outstanding book, and it just really leads you to just love the Lord. As I would say, the fifth and the last thing I would say that's just an absolute, just standout pro, before I give a few drawbacks, is her vision of God is so rich in the way that she presents Him, understanding the Scriptures, presenting Him as the humble God. She really reinforces that reality throughout this volume, that in His modes of disclosure, meaning omnipotence, omnipresence, and omniscience, and those 3 kind of modes of how He relates in a compatible, she uses the term theological compatibilism, which is really what classical Christianity is teaching, that these things are not contradictory, they're compatible. They're not necessarily always paradoxical. They're not dialectical. They're compatible. We don't know exactly how it all works. It is mystery, but they are compatible. God's nearness doesn't mean He's not far off. he's also beyond his nearness. And because he's beyond doesn't mean he's not near. There's these two things that are continually being intertwined and resting in one another that she just does this just bang up job about it, okay? But I just love what I've come away with the most from the book is the God we serve is humble. The God we serve is the most humble, even to the point of death on a cross, Philippians 2 teaches. She just infuses that throughout the book, and it is a glorious, rich understanding of God that really has supplemented my understanding so much more and has caused me to love the Lord so much deeper, to yield to him so much quicker, I think, actually, in other ways, knowing that he's so much more humble than I've ever given him credit for. And she just magnificently does that in this book from start to finish. So she calls him the humble, holy one, the humble, holy Lord. And as she does that through the book, it shows that not everything, as she likes to say, is Christology. Not everything is just Jesus, which is a little bit of a pushback on Karl Barth. Not everything is Christology. God himself is humble. He doesn't become humble in Christ only. He already is humble. So just a really rich, just shot through this whole book. So good. I mean, the book is just, there's just been times I will close the book, I will fall down, metaphorically speaking, and just pray and just thank God for how good he is and how humble he is to a sinner and a prideful person like myself. It's just so wonderful to see a theologian of such stature showing the grandeur of God washing our feet. It's just beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. What a great book. My only two drawbacks I would say is this. This is not, just from an academic challenging perspective, this is not in any respect an entry-level book. This is, even for someone who's read a lot of theology, this is almost an advanced, I would not say it's a monograph. So it's not that level of just written for academic people. The 50 or 60 out there that are going to read this monograph. It's not that. But it's kind of somewhere in between the intermediate and that. There are some chapters, like the section 4 that talks about omniscience. It's got some hard stuff in there to read. It's just challenging to read because she's not helping build your understanding of it. She just jumps right in. So, if you've not read Schleiermacher, you haven't read Barth, you haven't read Moltmann, you haven't read Pannenberg, you haven't read anybody else, she's assuming you have, to some degree. So it's going to be very challenging for you to keep up with her. So on a scale of 1 to 10, she's a 9. I mean, it's not just for academics, but it is a very challenging book on a consistent basis to read. So find a buddy if you want to read this book. But I would encourage you, prepare yourself. There might be a good couple books I could recommend to read before this. But if you can get to this book to read it, it's so worth it. But it's really a level 8 or 9, maybe 8.5 to 9. It's so hard, I think, in a lot of ways. But keep after it. She comes around and will help you understand it eventually, but you have to keep after it. It's challenging. The second drawback I would have, and this would be a little bit more of a drawback for me, is she is really trying to teach the doctrine of God without immediately jumping to the doctrine of the Trinity. And this is part of the Empire Strikes Back, right? We don't start with the Trinity. That's what all modern theologians in the Christian faith do. They just jump to the Trinity, right? She's like, not so fast, my friend. Not so fast, my friend. And I agree with her. I do actually. I think in many respects, I absolutely agree with her that we need to reinforce the unicity of God, the simplicity of God, the oneness of God. We need to recapture that. And so to do that, we have to strike back against the Trinitarian Renaissance that has really come about since, I probably wouldn't say, probably Moltmann especially, but a little bit before him too, is really where the Renaissance comes out of. I agree with her about 80%. There are times where I feel like she's stretching it a little bit and she doesn't want to jump ahead, but it causes the arguments to suffer a little bit. And she probably would say the same. But it causes some of her arguments to suffer just a little bit. And she does a great job still, though, of obviously not denying the need for the Trinity. She always says, this is the Trinity, but hold on, let's not get there yet. She does a good job of recognizing that. So it does draw back a little bit, I think, from the book and take away a little bit from the book because she's trying to hold off that discussion. She's trying not to say, let's just leap into that or to leap into the doctrine of Christ. She's really trying to say, no, let's focus on the oneness of God, that God is in no need of anything at all. He is the only, as Aquinas would say, the only necessary being. He's not contingent on anything. And she really focuses in on that. I think A+ on that, just absolutely breathtaking. But there are times when you're wondering, why is she not giving more to the need here for the Trinity? Why is she not allowing us to kind of wander into that space? I think she's really trying to protect us from the modernist incursion into the unicity and simplicity of God. And I applaud her for that, though I think it does lead to some weaknesses sometimes in the book in general. I love her discussion about love toward the end of the book, but it suffers a little bit. I know that she's not going to agree with me whatsoever, and everyone else is going to say the same thing as me. It's kind of like she doesn't see love as in need of another object. You're like, ooh, okay. So she doesn't see love as a polarity of some kind where you have to have an object and a subject. There doesn't need to be someone who's can't love unless there's an object to love. So she's trying to protect from the necessity of a creation, which I applaud her. That's biblical and orthodox. And she tries to protect from jumping into the Trinity right away. And so there's just, again, we don't want to get too technical with this little review here, but I would say there is, I think, I would love to have seen maybe a way for her to acknowledge more the need and the reality of the Trinity without feeling like she couldn't discuss it quite yet or is jumping to conclusions. I think, again, every doctrine, in the way I understand it, is they're all connected together. Everything's connected together because God is one. I mean, so to me, there should be some need to tip into that as we go through the book. But again, this book is breathtaking. Read it again with some minor caution. Again, she's not coming from a super conservative background. She comes out of a liberal Presbyterian background that transferred over in the 70s to the Anglican Communion, the Episcopalian denomination, essentially, which is a very liberal denomination in many respects. So be wary of that as you read the book. But she's not saying a whole lot of things that are super questionable, but she's going to have some things where she disagrees with some, if you're coming from more conservative backgrounds, she's going to not necessarily strongly disagree with you, but she's not going to say what you want her to say. So just be discerning as you read the book. But there's so much just amazingness in this book that you will be so blessed to read through this book carefully. I would say if you've not read, cover to cover or a lot of one theology book before, if you've not read one, singular volume of theology before, I would recommend you not to read this first. You will become saddened, discouraged, and frustrated, and you may quit forever. So don't do that, please. What I would recommend you to read are two other books. The first is The Wonderful Works of God, the one volume by Herman Bavinck. Used to be called Our Reasonable Faith. That's been published in the last few years in a new typeset version by Westminster Seminary Press. And that is an outstanding book. 10 to 12 page chapters, very simple to understand, very easy to read, and it'll get your mind around all the doctrines, their relationship, the organicness of it from Bavinck's perspective. That's a great place to start if you've never read just one book on theology, just beginning to end. The other book I would recommend you to read is Calvin. His 1541, I've recommended it time and time again on my channel. His 1541 English translation by Banner, 2014 by Robert White, which is a 17 chapter, 900-page book. Yes, it's long, but it is easy to read. It's such an easy book to read. You can read 20 pages at a time, 10 pages at a time as a devotional. You'll get it done in 8 months. It's a beautiful book. And once you read something like that, you might be ready for something, at least at the start of this. And find a buddy, though. Find a friend, phone a friend, man. Ladies, find someone to read this with, because this is challenging stuff. But I would tell you, just because it's hard doesn't mean that you shouldn't set a goal for it. I bought this book 5 years ago, and I said, you know what? I'm going to set a goal. I'm not quite ready to jump into Sonderegger, but I want to be. So I pursued and pushed myself, and lo and behold, I found a buddy, and here I am reading Katherine Sonderegger's volume, Systematic Theology, Volume 1, Doctrine of God. And you can see I've marked up quite a bit. I don't typically mark up all my books a whole lot. I mean, there are some that I will, but if I put in, I think maybe 100 tags and about 40 arrows, it means I'm going to return to this book a lot. That's how rich this book is. So I encourage you, if you want a book that basically harkens to The Empire Strikes Back and a female version of Master Yoda leading the way, this is the book for you. All right, signing off.